All right, we're back here with another episode of Inside TPM, where I talk to people at TPM about what they do at TPM and how it's going, and just have a conversation to let the readers and listeners and members of TPM get more of a sense of, who works here and how we operate. Today, we are here with Deputy Editor Nicole Lafond. Nicole, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Joe?
Very good, doing very, very well. Um, all right. I said in the invite I sent out to readers that you do a number of different things at TPM, and you've also had two stints at TPM.
Yeah.
So I think a good place to start would be, how did you hear of TPM? What brought you to TPM, and that whole origin story about, like, coming aboard?
Yeah. I feel like it's hard to explain without getting into like my whole life story because I think that TPM is like pretty integral to, I don't know, like my own political and intellectual awakening. And that's like a little dramatic, but it's kind of true. But yeah, I mean, I've been pretty open with TPM readers about my background. I grew up in the Midwest as, an evangelical Christian preacher's daughter and very grew up very patriotic, very conservative, very corn-fed, small town. I was a cheerleader in high school, for God's sakes. Like just very middle America. And I started a I did an internship in DC for a semester when I was in college, and I went to like a private Christian school for college. Olivet Nazarene University is what it's called. Which I got for mostly free because my dad's a Nazarene pastor. So it's like a
Got the hookup.
pipeline for the Christian right.
Yeah.
But I did a program in DC, which was mostly affiliated with conservative news outlets, and I interned for someone that everyone will recognize. I worked at the Daily Caller for Tucker Carlson. So like
Hmm.
it was uh it was at a time where I think I was just really politically naive and I always wanted to be a writer and I always wanted to be a storyteller, but I didn't really know, you know, what believed about things until I saw what I didn't like.
Hmm.
And that was kind of my experience um at the Daily Caller. But through that I got to do some cool reporting stuff. Like I got to go to the White House and go and sit on the press briefings and I developed a lot of skills, but it was just kind of a very uh it was an interesting experience. But all that to say, while I was working that semester in DC, I actually met a TPM alum, Sahil Kapoor, and he was like at a networking event, I think. And I ended up connecting with him and interviewing him for us my thesis that I was working on for the program that I was in. And I think it was
Hmm.
about like aggregation or something. I can't even remember what it was focused on, but at the time he worked at HuffPost, but previously he'd worked at TPM. So I interviewed him for that class paper and he told me about TPM and he was like, it sounds like you like the vibe and like the scrappiness of a digital news outlet, but here's a place that has better politics. um so for me, like I just started reading TPM after he told me about it, and all the disillusionment I was feeling with the work I was doing just kind of clicked because I was like, this is how I think about the world. And so I think that was like my junior year of college. And then by the time I graduated, TPM had an internship opening, I think the summer right after I graduated in 2014. And I applied for it and I got it somehow. And I think that I mean, we have like a running joke that you thought I was
Yeah.
a plant.
Yeah, there was a. Well, I don't think the rumor started with, or the idea started with me, but I kept it going. That, yeah, that
Yeah,
maybe,
you kept it running for sure.
yeah, that it was possible that you were a conservative, like undercover, like, and then
Maybe.
you're gonna go back, which is funny because as we've talked, and we're not like no names, please, but this is like a common thing at TPM actually, where a lot of us come from conservative backgrounds, maybe had been conservative ourselves, and then at some point had some sort of awakening and ended up at TPM. You know,
Yeah.
so it's a common thing.
Yeah, it is. And that's interesting. And I'm not sure, I think it's because, when you are raised a certain way, you have to fight even harder for like what you actually think. And um I don't know, I think that that kind of encourages like the intellectual development necessary to be like at the place and at the level that we strive to be at here. So,
Yeah,
uh,
that's a good point. There's a lot of like self-searching of like,
yeah,
do I really think this, or am I just like getting it from my parents? Like, and you want to justify it, and then, maybe it doesn't turn out like you hoped. I know exactly what you're saying. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah,
Oh,
I,
go.
yeah. Well, I was just gonna say I interned for that summer and I wanted to stay, but I had a job back in Illinois that I worked. I had a job lined up back in Illinois where I was like an education reporter for 3 years, but then I came back. So
Yes. Right,
yeah.
right. And I feel old because I was there for all of that. I was there when
Yeah.
when Sahil was still at TPM. So,
Oh,
um,
right. Yeah.
so like when you said he was at HuffPost by then, he had already left, and I had already been at TPM. So
Yeah.
time time flies. So now, I mean, you were a news writer when you started. And
Mhm.
you probably had several titles along the way, but now you're deputy editor. What is your day-to-day like? I know you do. You write and edit and manage things. So just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, I think every day is pretty different depending on the news cycle, but I tend to try to like, start my workday a little bit early by like drinking tea and catching up on the horrors of what happened overnight and just like really relaxing stuff. But no, I think I usually just check in and read like the overnight news and before the workday starts just because it's like, all right, you know, I want to make sure I have ideas for assignments to give out to the reporters that I work with. And so it's a little bit of that, a little bit of like pre-planning for the day. But yeah, so I spend some time each morning like figuring out what in an ideal scenario, like two of the reporters I work with most closely are Kaya and Amine. And so I try to come up with some ideas for them. And then, we start the workday. And sometimes, I get pitches from them and we talk through their ideas. But so it's kind of a little mix of like figuring out the scope of what's happening for the day, figuring out assignments, talking to the reporters through like their ideas as well. And also like housekeeping stuff. Like I edit morning memo, I um put stuff in our like live wire feed, I check for like freelance or cafe submissions that like may have come in overnight and just making sure stuff got promoted on social media, just like little stuff like that, the kind of stuff that
Mhm.
just keeps things running. But and at some point like during the day, I'll usually in the morning, I check in with the other editors, John and David, and we just talk through like what the focus for the day should be, or there's this thing coming up, like how do we want to approach it. And so we kind of talk through the day at that level, and then that kind of like trickles down to like how John and I give assignments to reporters and things like that. And if sometimes Kate, Riga, and Amina are on the Hill at the same time. So if it's a Hill day, like, I am kind of just talking through everything with them all day long. And we're in conversation about, like what lawmakers they were able to track down and what the story we want to focus on for the day is. And yeah, it's just kind of like every day is a little bit different, but it all is just a lot of talking and a lot of thinking through the reporting process for stories and figuring out deadlines and workflow. But like the big thing is just, framing up our coverage in a way that feels unique and interesting to TPM. And talking through pitches, and a lot of that is just me being like, all right, like what do we have? What do you need and how are you going to get it? And that's kind of
Hmm.
like how it boils down to my work as being an editor. So, and then at some point in the late afternoon, I try to start thinking about where things stand. The column, the newsletter, the thing that I write every day. Um, and John and I kind of brainstorm ideas. We He's like my sounding board there, but
Hmm.
some days it's easier, some days it's harder to come up with something depending on the news cycle. But
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that because in addition to, like you said, the editing and the working with the reporters, you're the overseer and primary author for two of TPM's like uh products, so to speak, the Weekender and Where Things Stand. And those are both, I mean, they're very different from each other, and they're also different from the ordinary news flow from the reporters. So I was eh, curious about your philosophy for each of those and like how you approach them and what you're trying to like what you're trying to do for the readers with those versus like the ordinary coverage.
yeah. Um, well, I would say the philosophy for the Weekender evolves. It has evolved over time.
Hmm.
I think I inherited both of those products from other TPM staff members. I think at some point, like I know that David Tainer and John were both involved in those before I became an editor. So it's kind of something that I took up at some point when I became an editor. And when I first took over the Weekender, um, I mean, it served a lot of purposes over time, but like to be honest, when I first took it over, it was right during COVID, like right when
Mm.
quarantine started, and we were just doing work from home for the first time. And that was a special time because it was kind of like a lifeline for me. And I think like a lot of TPM readers, I don't know, I just felt like there was a very specific sense of community that we created through the Weekender because it was just this side thing that had its own readership and has its own readership and is a little bit more casual than what the editorial standards that we got put into like hard breaking news stories. And so
Hmm.
at least during when I first took it over, a lot of what I was doing was just like talking about like living and surviving in Brooklyn during a global
Right.
pandemic and being in quarantine and um just like stories from my life and like relating that back to the news and I don't know, it was like a very special time, and I think a lot of like I felt close to a lot of TPM readers, Weekender readers specifically, but it was like a cool kind of safe space. But I think we kind of obviously we're not in a global pandemic anymore, kind of, but like we've transitioned out of that, and its purpose is just to be like a casual newsletter, and also like bonus content that we have on the site over the weekend to keep people informed of the themes and storylines that we care about, but it's kind of a more laid back version of the serious reporting we do at TPM. And so sometimes I ask reporters, you know, to write up a item for the newsletter that's like more personal and reflects on their coverage, or to share an experience that they had while they were, I asked Josh Kaminsky to do this a lot when he was covering the Trump trials, to just like tell us stuff that was happening in the room that you didn't get put in your story that's interesting.
Hmm.
And because I think that kind of stuff is cool, and I think that creates a sense of like, I don't know, you're speaking directly to readers and you're also bringing them along with you on the reporting process. And um, sometimes I ask them to, if they reported out like a really intense story and there's some string left over that didn't make it into the piece, but they still think is interesting and worth bringing to people's attention. So it kind of varies, but it's like a behind the scenes look at some of the work that people are doing. But it's also another space for people like reporters to go deeper on something that they maybe wouldn't necessarily work into like a typical story or do a story on its own. Like Kaya does this a lot for a weekender, for example, and she recently and is actually this week doing kind of like a dive into explaining this conspiracy theory that's at the root of Lee Zeldin's push to try to get the Justice Department to investigate some like Biden administration era EPA grant contracts that
Hmm.
um, are becoming of that the story is at the root of a larger story that we care about, which is like the Justice Department and the erosion of independence from the White House. And so she, did a bunch of research and found out that there's actually this like Project Veritas and a Stacey Abrams conspiracy theory at the heart of all of this drama. So that's like an example of something that we would share with readers in the weekender.
Hmm.
Just kind of. So I guess my
Yeah,
philosophy,
I think what did we called it like TPM with a teardown, I think is what we
yeah,
said.
or like in
Yeah.
weekend mode.
Yeah, weekend mode. And I was
Yeah,
gonna say you when you were saying before that you create a community, um obviously it's not that uncommon for people to like come up to Josh on the street because like he's runs the site. He's not done it
yeah,
for like his whole life.
yeah,
But it is less common for people to recognize other people at TPM, but people do recognize you for writing the Weekender, and that's something that I've seen happen in real life. So I
yeah,
think that yeah, the connection you formed during COVID was real, that's for sure.
yeah, yeah. And I think that that's just special, and it's a unique, cool thing to be part of. Where things stand is a little different in terms of like philosophy and approach. It's kind of sort of like very literally what the title is, but
Hmm. Yeah.
but I use it as a tool to help communicate to readers what storylines we care about and um what we editorially think is important and um what we're focused on in any given news cycle. And like I tend to, I mean, I write it pretty much every single day. Sometimes I'll have a guest author if I'm, buried under edits and someone has a good idea.
Hmm.
I'm like, always love having the reporters step in and do that too. But honestly, when I became an editor, I think I volunteered to take it up as like my responsibility because and I back then it was something different. It was kind of like a rundown of the stuff that we were watching that day, and it was published at noon, I think, every day. And then it kind of became something else when I took it over. But I asked for it because I wanted to still write. And
Hmm.
um, I don't know, I'm someone who learns through writing, and I don't know if
Yeah.
that's like weird, but information does not stick in my brain unless I write about it. And I think that that's just because of journalism in general. But
Hmm.
so yeah, that was something I really wanted to do. And it's been a really useful tool for me in my own development as an editor because I just like am able to, you know, not just be editing on from on high about story or focus or our TPM's perspective on something. Like I'm actually literally like setting that agenda, I guess, or just
Hmm.
framing up like and explaining to readers why they should be paying attention to this specific thing. And I also sometimes use it as like context, or I use it as a place to unpack the backstory to something, um, or to just um, explain TPM's philosophy or explain like why this is the thing you should have your hair on fire if you're going to have your hair on fire about something.
Right, right.
So,
Speaking of TPM's philosophy, I wanted
mhm.
to ask because I obviously when you started you were a news writer and you did a lot of aggregation and now we don't even have news writers anymore. We don't have that job really. And you would write for Livewire and now Livewire went away. We brought Livewire back, but it's like radically different than what it was then. And so, having been a news writer, a reporter, and now deputy editor over, several years, I'm curious, like how, from your perspective, TPM's like philosophy to covering the news has evolved. And just like what you think about that. How would you describe it to readers, and kind of why you think it's important for it to evolve? Because like a lot of news outlets that existed in that time period are basically doing the exact same thing they've always done, I would
Yeah.
imagine.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think like obviously the stories that we cover have changed over the years, but I think the thing that makes us different is like, our approach has changed too. The stories we cover, the volume with which we are publishing stories and all of that stuff evolves with time based on like the news environment, I think. But so I think the stories have changed, but the themes have kind of remained similar, at least in my head. And a big part of what TPM has always been focused on, and like TPM's ethos, is this idea of calling out public corruption. And obviously, there's more of that now than there ever has been, to the point that sometimes it feels quaint to talk about the old things that we used to talk about. But so that's a constant is, I think we've always been focused, our philosophy has always been focused on calling out public corruption. Um, and now we're just kind of in it's at a different tier and a different level of emergency that's ever been in. But um, another thing that I think, has kept us sets us apart from other news outlets that like have evolved or haven't evolved in whatever way within the digital media world, is that we've always been really good at like picking our lanes.
Mhm.
And I don't know, like we don't try to cover every single thing that all the other news outlets are covering. That's impossible, and we're too small for that. But we tend to identify gaps in others' reporting, or more importantly, in the political narrative and tone that's being set um, in the mainstream media. And I think one of the things that I like most about TPM is, we're not shy about the fact that we have a perspective, and we talk about we know, I think that we look at the world in the way that's correct, and like sometimes that comes out in certain ways, but like I think that the um we've always done a good job of like helping readers understand what is wrong with the political narrative in any given moment, and what we think is, the correct way to be talking about what's happening. But in terms of what's changed, I think, I mean, there's a lot of things I could think of, like specific examples. Like we used to do a lot of media coverage of like the media industry when I first started. Um, and also, I mean, I remember when I was an intern, I was doing a lot of stories and posts about like Ann Coulter and Rush Limbaugh, and like what happened on the Daily Show the night before, and just kind of like keeping up with what the right wing media was doing at any given time. And we still pay attention to that, and we still are talking about the freaks over there. But like when Kate and I were on the morning shift, the 6 a.m. morning shift, we used to watch like Fox and Friends every morning, and sometimes write about what they were doing. Like uh it was something that we were a lot more in tune to. But I think that that's kind of changed because everyone's just adopted the MAGA Fox News persona at this point.
Yeah, like the fringe just became mainstream. So it's
Yeah,
like,
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and so I think we've like moved away from like media coverage, but it's kind of the same thing because it's just another example of like characters. Like TPM's always
mhm.
been really good at identifying and elevating the bad acts of crazy characters who may have been on the fringe at one point, but are now like literally running the government. So, um, yeah, I think something that's, stayed consistent throughout my entire time here is TPM's value and interest and obsession with these right-wing characters. Like I remember there was one point forever ago, we were doing like a new guy alert in the Weekender because I like couldn't come up with a better name for it, but it was just like tracking these new freaks that Matt Shuham was encountering as he was covering like militias and extremist groups back in like I don't know 2017, 2016. And I think one of the things about working here is you kind of become like intimately familiar with these kind of like right-wing weirdos.
I can remember the first time he dropped in Slack, like new guy alert, and it's like I don't even remember who it was. It could have been like Emil Both, like he's like
Yeah,
an
it
example
could
of a
have
guy
been.
who came on the scene and now he's, like you said, he's like at the power center
Yeah,
of America. So
totally. Yeah. Yeah. So those are like the first few things that come to mind that like our coverage has obviously changed and evolved, but there's these like consistencies in the ethos that is TPM that like always keeps us always keeps us going.
I'm curious specifically how, from a journalistic perspective, from an editorial perspective, uh, this first month of Trump has felt different than the first 4 years of Trump.
Yeah. Yeah, I was actually listening to an episode of Pod Save America, and they were talking about how chaotic the first Trump administration was at first, and how a lot of their early actions were like immediately shut down or held up in court. And I guess I don't really remember the details of that as much as I remember that we were being really careful at TPM about like not being reactive to everything that Trump is doing. Like we would have the TVs on and he would start talking about that we when we used to work in the newsroom, we always had the cable news TVs on, and so anytime Trump would like decide to scream at the press pool for an hour and a half, we were always like, all right, let's see what he says, kind of thing. But yeah, back then, like Trump would start talking about like shithole countries, and before you know it, you're in like a whole news cycle of talking about like immigration policy and his demeaning rhetoric, and like congressional Democrats are passing some resolution to condemn his language, and we did some of that. Like we were a part of covering some of that, and I think the difference now is like that all feels kind of quaint in this current moment because it was a time when constitutional norms mattered, and that's the difference this time. Like I even the impeachments, I can't imagine that happening in today's house. Obviously, I mean the Republicans control the house, but even if Democrats were in charge, like I don't know, I don't know that these kinds of pillars of accountability are even exist anymore, or at least not in the ways that they used to, because we're seeing like Trump's taking a sledgehammer to the separation of powers, and like and Republicans don't even care. Like they don't care that
Mhm.
the money that they're fighting over right now to try to figure out a budget for to set Trump's fiscal agenda. Um, they don't they don't care that like what are we fighting about when you pass a budget and it sets the federal spending for however many years. But Trump is already demonstrating that he doesn't care that like Congress is the one that has the authority to delegate that and appropriate that. So um I think the difference is there was a lot of chaos in the first Trump administration. Everyone was like reacting to the racist things he was saying, and now it's almost like that the filter is just a lot uh different. And the chaos this time is a lot more sinister. It feels I think it's overwhelming by design because they want the media to be scrambling so much that there's like never an opportunity to go deep enough or to hold him accountable for what he's doing right now.
Mhm.
So, um, I don't know. Yeah, I guess it's different in the sense that obviously all these norms and precedent still matter, but like you can't even keep up enough to like yell about them. So,
Yeah.
and that's why I think that like I don't know, the stuff that we're doing right now is pretty valuable because we're focused on a handful of important coverage themes, which, we're diving in deep on the budget legislation in Congress and the ways in which Democrats are trying to ask for assurances that, they're not going to help keep the government open or to prevent a shutdown if they're not going to get assurances that Trump's not going to like illegally stop spending money that they appropriated. So we've been focused a lot on that. And we've been covering like the ongoing erosion of DOJ independence from the White House and all the forms that that takes. Because every day there's a new example of something insane happening there. And then like Kate's done a lot of stuff on Trump's assault on independent agencies from within the executive branch. And so we're kind of mostly focused on like corruption, but also the retribution and the destruction that's happening in whatever forms that that takes. I
Hmm.
think that in the first term, there was just so much that was norm shattering and strange and different that like the stuff that was getting the most traction was just everything that Trump said every day and his tweets
Hmm.
yelling. So
Yeah. Yeah, I remember you're right. Like he would get up on TV and you'd kind of like gather around to see what kind of like insane diarrhea would come out of his mouth,
yeah.
And now it's like, it's beyond rhetoric. Now there's actually actions, and he's kind of he's shed like all the people that he had around him the first time who were like kind of normal. And now he's
Yeah,
just
the
surrounded
adults
by
in the room.
all,
Yeah.
yeah, right, exactly. So now it's just pure lunacy.
Yeah.
All right, I want to shift gears. Well, I should mention producer Jackie says the big difference is that everyone is more depressed now. We're all just,
Yeah, that's another one.
yeah.
That's good.
I want to sh shift gears now. I like to ask everybody a few standard questions. First is like if there's a book you've read recently that you would recommend. It doesn't have to be a new book. It could be any book, just something you would recommend and why.
Yeah. Um, yeah, okay, so there's a philosophy to what I'm about to explain, but a lot of the media that I consume right now outside of work that's like purely for enjoyment is kind of like rooted in a desire to escape this timeline. So I have been doing like reading and watching a lot of stuff that I just never watched before. Like I'm currently watching Lost for the first time and The
Mhm.
Sopranos for the first time. Um, just of another era stuff that's interesting. And I've been listening to a podcast from one of my favorite comedians who has like a huge backlog. So I started like I'm in 2017. I'm listening to them talk about stuff that's happening back then, and it's great. I've also been reading Game of Thrones, but that's another story. But a book that I read recently that I really enjoyed was I Even Cowgirls Get the Blues. It's like it's one of I've been working my way through Tom Robbins stuff for years. Like I think
Okay.
first ones I read of his was Still Life with Woodpecker, which is also one of my favorite books. But it's like this really absurd and crass and like really like beautiful tale of female empowerment through like flaws and deformities. It's about this character named Sissy, and she's like this conventionally attractive poor girl from the Midwest who was born with like massive thumbs. And the story is kind of like about her embracing the like power and magic of these like monstrous thumbs that she has, and just her life journey. She becomes like a professional hitchhiker and she ends up living on a cowgirl ranch, and it's like came out in 1993, so it like fits my escapism theme, but I just love Tom Robbins stuff is just uh it's just weird and it's kind of mystical and it's not really rooted in reality and everyone's got these like philosophical awakenings that are like bizarre and kind of out of, out of this world stuff. But yeah, that's one that I just recently read that I
Great,
would recommend.
great, great.
Yeah.
You mentioned you were making your way through Sopranos and Lost, but you haven't finished them, so they can't be your answer for if there's a movie or series that you recently saw that you would recommend.
Yeah. Um, yes. Okay, so uh the show that I just recently watched, which is new, I think it was the third season that just came out, but it's called Somebody Somewhere. It's on HBO. Um, and it is just as wholesome and sweet and like a beautiful portrayal of platonic friendship and like the importance of community and joy as it is gut-wrenching and like it's one of those shows where I'm laughing as much as I'm like sobbing on the couch. It's
Yeah.
about grief and mourning and forgiveness and dealing with loss and but all of it is through this lens of like the beauty and like the importance of uh non-romantic love and platonic love, and it's just like highly recommend. It's really good.
Cool. I guess while we're on the subject, the Oscars are on Sunday. Do you have any strong Oscar takes?
um Not really. I haven't really watched a lot of movies this year. Like I think
Hmm.
that I have a take, but it's gonna get me like canceled or something. But um through so I'm the TPM has a union and we are unionized through WGAE. And so through that I get all the like screeners for
Hmm.
the various films that are being considered for the Oscars. And I didn't watch a lot of them this year because they all came in the form of uh weird codes and stuff instead of like the physical copy, which is what I like
Yeah.
because I'm old like that, I guess. But okay, so I watched Wicked and I thought it was great and really good, but I think that it needs to be watched in theaters to have the emotional reaction that everyone's telling me about.
I think you're right. You
Because
mean like in theaters, like the movie? You have to watch the movie in theaters.
yeah, like
Yeah.
seeing the movie in the theater. And I was able to watch it when it was like from the comfort of my couch when it's still in theaters and I don't know, there's a bit of a disconnect for me and maybe I just don't like follow the I think I wasn't a theater kid and that might be
Mm.
part of my uh so that's not really a take. That's just a movie that got a lot of hype that I didn't really understand, but um
No, I think it's crazy that it's going to be two movies. I mean, I've seen the show in theaters,
yeah,
and I know that there's like a whole world of lore that there's several books that make up Wicked.
right,
I guess, but
right.
when I saw that it's going to be two movies, I was like, man, could have been a memo. I think I could didn't. It's a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah. Well,
But
um,
yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of an off year for the Oscars. I'll just get my takes out here while we're on the
yeah.
subject.
What
I
are
mean,
your
I think like Amelia Perez is like one of the worst movies I've ever seen in my life. It's so bad. It's so bad. And I thought Wicked was fine. I saw The Substance. I didn't think it was that good. It's fine. I think The Brutalist is amazing. Um, and I still have to see, I have like my homework for today and tomorrow is I need to see Nora and
Mm,
Nickel Boys and the Bob Dylan one. Those are the three I haven't seen. But
okay.
like you go ahead.
I was gonna say the Brutalist is like the 3.5 hour long one or something,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I was there was something happening on a Friday and John and David and I were discussing like a coverage plan in case something happened over the weekend. And I was like, uh, from this time to this time on Saturday, I'm gonna be like in a movie theater for 3.5 hours watching this movie. And so I might be a little MIA. And John was like, "Oh, are you seeing The Brutalist?" And I was like, "No, actually, they were playing the Return of the King and Alamo." And um I was like, "No, it's more embarrassing than that, actually."
Okay, that's a good segue though.
Oh
Because
yeah.
I did want to ask some Lord of the Rings questions. Like probably the biggest Middle Earth fans at TPM. Uh, did you saw you were a fan of the War of the Rohirrim though?
I loved
That's
it.
a yeah, okay. So I thought that was I thought it was great. I would like to see more Middle Earth anime, I think
Yeah.
this year.
Yeah.
But I
There were
really
so
wanted
many
to ask, oh,
Easter
go ahead.
eggs.
Go
No,
ahead.
there's so many Easter eggs for like the real Tolkien
Yeah,
fans.
talk about some of those. I mean, we're getting into spoilers here, but because some of them I didn't notice and you picked up on. Like I didn't realize, for example, that the narrator was
Miranda Otto,
yeah, yeah.
Eowyn. Miranda Otto plays Eowyn. Yeah, there was that. There was the okay, there's like somebody dies at some point and they have the like Rohirrim like burial or whatever. And the song that they sang is the same one that Eowyn's character sang um when Theoden's son died in the Two Towers. And then like obviously Howard Shore composed the soundtrack, and so this they played the Riders of Rohan um score during like good parts, like big chunks of the movie, but they also tweaked it a little bit to have its own little unique flavor. Um there were a few other things I'm not thinking of at the moment. Um there was like the narrator Miranda Otto. I don't know, it's just like little stuff that if you're a Tolkien Middle Earth person, it's like I'm just happy to be in Middle Earth again.
Yeah.
I don't have a lot of I don't have high standards. I just like Peter Jackson content, you know?
Yeah. I thought it was clever the way they took like a character who was named like she's in the appendices,
Yeah.
but like they don't tell you anything about her. It's just kind of like the daughter
Yeah.
and like build a story. It was just it's a clever way to build
I
out the
think
universe.
yeah, she's just named, or she's not even, they don't say her name in the appendix. It's just like the daughter of something and
Yeah,
like a
right.
casual mention. Yeah.
Yeah. How are you liking Rings of Power?
I like it. I like it a lot. I think that okay, I think especially I loved the first season because Galadriel is my like ride or die girl. Like she's my favorite character in the books and in the trilogy. And so being able to just fully get in a whole season of her backstory is great. Um I don't know. I'm not one of those people who's like up in arms about sticking to canon or like getting mad about the race of actors playing certain characters. That stuff is so stupid. Obviously, Bezos sucks, but like I'm just happy to be in Middle Earth if I can.
Yeah. There's a whole range of media for me where I can't go on Reddit and read about it
Yeah.
because the lunatics are out of the asylum. Like you can't really read about Rings of Power or you hear about how it's deviating too much from the lore. They just came out, like I'm a huge fan of these book the Witcher series of books and the video games, and they just came out with the animated film on Netflix that I like, and the nerds are like, oh, here we go again. Like they just made it Little Mermaid, but for The Witcher, which I don't want to get into and explain, but there's a whole thing. And then there's a whole other like culture of incels where if you have a video game with like a male lead and then the sequel has like a woman as the lead, it's like, ah, here we go. Like
DEI.
DEI is taking over video games. Like we might as well just kill ourselves. And yeah, so
Yeah.
it's the same. It was the same. It's the same thing. the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think the Rings of Power is just it's based on literally the appendix of one of the books, The Return of the
Yeah.
King. And so most of it, I mean, at least from what I remember from reading, it is really it follows the storyline almost exactly. So I don't really know what people are upset about other than it's maybe there's like a few things that are added because it's Amazon and they're making like I don't know, hundreds of $1 million
Yeah. Right. Right.
so
Right.
there's gonna be some flourishes, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, last question I wanted to ask you. I know you're big, well, who everyone listens to a lot of podcasts. So to say you're like a big podcast person is kind of like a ridiculous boomer thing to say. But there's a specific, I know you're a fan of specific podcasters. I
Yes.
wanted to let you talk about this.
Yeah, so I listen to a lot of podcasts. I think that that is like my people always ask me what my hobby is, and I'm like, I don't really know. I have hobbies, but my favorite thing to do is listen to podcasts and walk around Brooklyn. Like we live in the coolest city. Every time you leave your house, you're gonna see some weird stuff. Um, yeah, it's one of it just makes me that's how I decompress. But um Kate and I are both really big fans of Michael Hobbs, who is this journalist and podcaster who he has quite a few different podcasts. One of them is Maintenance Phase, which is kind of it's a podcast that he does with Aubrey Gordon, and it's like debunking the myths of the wellness community,
Mhm.
which is huge and like has changed my life in a lot of ways, honestly, just from listening to it and thinking about body image and the ways that women have been, brainwashed by the media over the years. And like it's really good. They talk about everything from like RFK Jr.'s backstory to like Ozempic to uh a lot of um a lot of their focus is on like different like fitness instructors who I think they did a Richard Simmons series. It's just really good stuff.
Mhm.
And he's just one of my favorite people to listen to. I actually don't know what he looks like, and I've never looked him up because I have an idea in my head of what he looks like, and that's what I see when I'm listening to him. But that's so
I
what?
have a I have a similar aversion to people where I know their voice. I like don't
Yeah,
wanna I don't want to know what they sound like. Like when I
yeah.
saw the guy, I grew up watching Batman the animated series, and when I finally saw the guy who voiced Batman, I was like, "You gotta be kidding me! That can't be that deep, sonorous voice." But yeah,
Jarring.
yeah.
Yeah, in my head, he looks like the guy who plays Elrond in the
I
Rings.
hope he sees that. I hope he sees this.
Um, anyways, I love Maintenance Phase. I love his other podcast called If Books Could Kill, which is like
Mm,
they essentially take airport books and like really bad self-help books and explain how shallow and vapid and bad they are. Love that one. But my favorite is You're Wrong About, which takes it's essentially like millennial catnip, I think, where it's
mm,
like all of these cultural myths and phenomenons and like media frenzies that have happened in our lifetime or just before we were born. And it basically explains like the real story of what happened there, like everything from like Iran Contra to the Jonestown massacre kind of
mm,
stuff. And he does that podcast with Sarah Marshall. He doesn't do that podcast anymore, but there's a really long backlog of stuff that he did for that podcast as well. And that was my favorite of his. So yeah, big Michael Hobbs fans over here at
yeah. Yeah.
TPM.
All right. So I think we could leave it there. Nicole, thank you so much for joining me today to do this. Thanks for everybody who's watching. And yeah, have a good one. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.